Hello, everyone, and welcome tonight. My name is Glenn Rawson. It is Sunday night, March 9th, 8 p.m. Mountain Time, Mountain Daylight Time as of today. And welcome to our Fireside tonight. There are some new stories to share with you. I hope you enjoy it. Again, I welcome you. Now, as I did last week, and I received a very favorable response, please talk to me tonight. I read all of the comments that come across these broadcasts and try to respond as well as I can. So talk to me. Where are you watching from? How many of you are watching? And especially, which of these stories that I share with you tonight, which one is your favorite story or your two or three favorites? I'd like to know that. And again, since this is coming via social media, most of you are beginning to know how this social media thing works. My success is based on the number of people that are watching. So please be sure to like or follow the page where you see this and share it with somebody else. That goes a long way to supporting this cause and getting it out to other people. As you probably have already appreciated, as I've said it before, this is not a money-making venture. Not at all. This is more like share the gospel with somebody else, lift them up, and help them to have a good day. Now, this is my money-making venture. I'm going to be traveling again in the month of April. As I mentioned last week, the first tour in April is the Mesa Easter Pageant. I'm going with the Harringtons, Nate Harrington and Teton Stage Lines, and we're going down to the Mesa Easter Pageant. If you would like to go, there'll be the pageant, of course, some temple sessions on the way down and back, and there will be a lot of stories about our early pioneer fathers in Arizona and Utah. So if you'd like to go and have a great week of fun, learning church history, going to the temple, come with us. Go to tetonstagelines.com. And then again, in May and June, there is the Mormon Battalion Tour. I talked about that last week. And the Martin's Cove Tour in the first 3 days of May. If there are any tours of church history you'd like to go with Dennis and I on, go to historyofthesaints.org and check it out. We would love to have you. Tonight, would you have a prayer in your heart? A prayer for me, a prayer for each other? Would you pray? I have faith in that power. This first story, forgive the title, but it does get your attention. In the spring of 1859, President Brigham Young led an expedition into the harsh Red Rock country of southern Utah. It is believed that he went down to learn for himself why so many people had gone down into the southern area of Utah and then quit the country and moved on, abandoned their mission. June 1st, 1859, his 58th birthday, he was coming back from Santa Clara, Utah, passing through Tonakent. I'm not sure how you say that name. I don't know the area that well. When he all of a sudden stood up and, quoting, beheld in vision a future city, motioning to his companions, still quoting, to draw near and to follow the sweep of his hand, he spoke these prophetic words, quote, "There will yet be built between these volcanic ridges a city with spires, towers, and steeples, with homes containing many inhabitants," end of quote. Fired by that vision of a multitude of people in that remote area, President Brigham Young returned north to Salt Lake City and began making preparations to fulfill it. As part of the planning and preparation, it is reported that President Brigham Young asked Elder George A. Smith if he might give the city its new name. Accordingly, President Young named the new city St. George, after his friend and counselor. And then during the Sunday morning session of the church's October 1861 General Conference, Elder George A. Smith stood at the pulpit and read without advance notice to anyone the names of 309 families called to go down, build up St. George, and fulfill the vision of a prophet. It is important to note here that most of those who were called had, quote, heard of the inhospitable region, a hot, dry, thinly settled land where few would have chosen to settle, end quote. Parley P. Pratt had once described the area of St. George thus: it opens to the view for at least 80 miles and presents a wide expanse of chaotic matter. Huge hills, sandy deserts, cheerless, grassless plains, perpendicular rocks, loose, barren clay, dissolving beds of sandstone, and various other elements lying in inconceivable confusion. In short, he said, a country in ruins, dissolved by the pelting of storms of ages or turned inside out, upside down by terrible convulsions in some former age. End of quote. Welcome to St. George. The missionaries to what would come to be called Utah's Dixie were to leave right away. A month later, 29 Swiss families were added to those called to go. Now, of those 309 families, Elisha Everett heard of his call, quote, dropped in his chair and said, I'll be damned if I'll go, end quote. But after a moment, he stood up and said, well, if we're going to Dixie, we'd better start to get ready. End of quote. Wandle Mace heard his name called and said, I had not the remotest idea that I would be needed, nor did I feel the least inclined to go. But as soon as I heard the call, my feelings changed, and I not only felt willing, but anxious to respond to the call. End quote. John and Margaret Moody were understandably upset at their call. He didn't want to go. However, he prayed about it, and a hymn began coursing through his mind that convinced him that he was, quote, called by the Spirit of God, end quote. And then John said, those bad feelings began to leave me, and soon I was entirely free of them. End quote. Robert Gardner, another story. A successful and established businessman in Salt Lake was not at the conference. And when he heard about the call, he said, I looked and spit, took off my hat, scratched my head, and thought, all right. The next day, he said, I went up to Salt Lake City and saw George A. Smith in the historian's office. He laughed, George A. He laughed when I went in and said, don't blame anyone but me. The president told me to get up a list of names suitable for that mission, so I thought of you for one and thought you'd be willing to go if called. So I put your name down. But if you don't want to go, step to the president's office and ask him to take your name off the list, and he will do it. To which I said, Robert Gardner, I said, I expected he would, but I shan't try him. I have come to find out what kind of fit outs are wanted and when to go. To which George A. said, "That's the kind of men we want." End of quote. And it still is. It still is. So it went. Each of those called with their own story, but when it was over, most of them went. And the country was just as hard as they had heard, and the mission just as challenging as they had expected it to be. Nevertheless, the mission was successful, and today, President Brigham Young's vision has been fulfilled and is yet being fulfilled. Why do I tell you that story? Because thank the Lord Almighty for those of you who are willing to answer the difficult call, who have been and will yet be, whether it be to open up a country or open the door of the nursery next Sunday. Thank you. Miracles will follow your call. This is an old story going back going all the way back to the childhood of my oldest daughter. There's so much good and beauty in this world. I get annoyed with those sour-faced pickle suckers who won't see the good and won't see the positive, whether it be in nations or whatever. There is good everywhere, not just in the church or in your church. This story is about unlikely, but yet inspirational heroes. You remember, many years ago, our family purchased a brand new movie called The Little Mermaid. We watched that Disney movie over and over. However, as it is with all great shows, we soon knew it by heart and watched it less frequently. That is, except for one little girl, our oldest daughter. Something in that movie captured Sharice's imagination, and she found a hero in Ariel. Ariel was so pretty, and her voice so beautiful, and her prince was a prince indeed. One day, her mother said, "Your hair in the water looks just like Ariel's." And that little girl decided to grow it out just as long and pretty as Ariel. She even wanted to dye it red. When Ariel captured the love of her prince, our daughter dreamed of her future love and practiced batting her eyes like this. Her favorite scene in that movie was when Ariel had rescued Eric from drowning. He was lying on the beach, you remember? And Ariel was on the rock just offshore, singing to him. And if you remember, there's that moment when Ariel raised herself up, and with her hair blowing in the wind and the spray, she sang of being part of his world. Oh, it was beautiful. That scene captured Sharice's imagination. It filled her heart with love and inspiration, and she wanted to live it for herself. So she began to practice for her own moment. She learned all the moves and all the songs, and more importantly, she learned to sing until she sounded just like Ariel. One day, I came home from work and found her sitting in her position on her ocean rock, which actually was an old beat-up recliner in the front room. And there was Sharice singing with all of her heart along with Ariel. Now, I don't remember this, but that daughter later said that I leaned over and said to her mother, "Listen to her. She's getting so good. She sounds just as good as Ariel." I didn't know it at the time, but Cherise heard me, and her heart swelled. From that moment on, she believed that she could sing, and sing she did. In the years that followed, Cherise and I traveled together, kind of like a music and a spoken word on the road. I would speak at firesides and devotionals, and she would sing. Her lovely voice and sweet spirit touched so many people for good. Now, years later, many years later, she has indeed found her prince, and he's a good man. She has babes of her own, and she lives, regrettably, a long ways away from me. I very seldom get to see her. But every so often, my phone would ring, and I would answer it, and it would be her singing. She would hear a song on the radio that reminded her of me, and she would call me and sing along with the radio to me. A mermaid taught my daughter to sing, and oh, so much good came of it. My dear friends, there is beauty and inspiration everywhere, goodness everywhere, if we will look for it. Next story. February 17th, 1801, Washington, D.C., and the newly constructed Capitol building. A most significant vote was called in the United States House of Representatives. This would be the 36th ballot cast on the same issue. What was this momentous moment and vote, and why did it change the course of the history of the United States of America? During the administration of the second president of the United States, John Adams, two distinct political parties were formed with very different ideological differences. It was inevitable. The parties were the Federalists, led by President John Adams and Alexander Hamilton. On the other side, opposing their policies, were the Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. As President Adams's term drew to a close, the two parties, the Federalists and the Republicans, put forth their candidates. The Federalists nominated John Adams, the incumbent, for a second term as president, and Charles Cotesworth Pinckney of South Carolina as his running mate and vice president. Similarly, the Democratic Republicans nominated Adams as vice president, Thomas Jefferson, and his running mate, Aaron Burr of New York. Well, even by today's standards, that campaign was bitter and acrimonious, to say the least. It more resembled the incivility and slander of a modern election than it did the high-minded, disinterested, virtuous, and patriotic campaigns so highly touted in the late 18th century, early 19th century. Now, if you know anything about the structure of government at that time, under the Constitution of the United States, it was the Electoral College that elected the president and vice president. On December 3rd, 1800, those electors in the House of Representatives cast their votes. They were opened and counted in the Senate, and it stood 73 votes for Jefferson and 73 votes for Aaron Burr. Adams and Pinckney had lost, but it was a tie. 73 votes for Thomas Jefferson, but 73 votes for Aaron Burr. The vote was then sent into the House of Representatives, where the 16 states were each allowed one vote, and the winner had to carry 9 states. When the ballot was cast, it was 8 votes for Jefferson and 6 for Burr, with 2 states divided and thus their vote canceled out. You had to have 9, a majority, to win. Jefferson only had 8. And so they voted again. Same result. Again, same result. 35 times the House of Representatives voted for who would be the president of the United States. I share this story of sordid partisan politics with you because of what happened that finally resolved it. What happened behind the scenes is an amazing story. Aaron Burr, as I told you, was on the ticket as the vice presidential candidate, not the president. Burr was considered by many a very unprincipled and unscrupulous man of indomitable ambition. He was, as history has proven, an immoral profligate bent on power, as some already knew, and his future actions would certify. Burr should have deferred to Jefferson, but Burr refused, thus forcing 35 ballots in the Federalist-controlled House of Representatives. It was a deadlock. So what happened? Believe it or not, the impasse was finally broken by Alexander Hamilton, an avowed Federalist. Hamilton went with zeal and force among his Federalist colleagues and persuaded them to vote for Jefferson. Now understand, Jefferson and Hamilton were ardent, strident, political enemies. If there was a man of the Revolutionary era with whom Hamilton disagreed with more than Jefferson, we don't know who that might have been. Yet, in the 36th ballot, thanks to Hamilton, some of those Federalists switched their vote to Jefferson, and he became, by that narrow margin, the President of the United States. Why? Why? I tell you this story because there is a powerful lesson for America in this story. Why did Hamilton do this? Because he loved his country more than his party. He urged the Federalists, his allies, to support Jefferson, his enemy, because, quoting, he was by far not so dangerous a man as Burr. In short, Hamilton would much rather have someone with wrong principles than someone devoid of any. End of quote, meaning Burr. Hamilton represents those courageous and virtuous individuals who care more about the good of the country, the good of all of us, than the special partisan power-grabbing interests of the few. Hamilton averted a constitutional crisis in this brand new republic, and did so at the expense of his party, which party would never recover. The presidential election of 1800 is so significant that it is remembered in history as the Revolution of 1800. Why would it be considered that? Because it was the first peaceful transfer of power between opposing parties. Unlike in regimes all around the world and throughout previous history, President John Adams respected the Constitution and quietly and with dignity surrendered power to his opponent, Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Alexander Hamilton. Though these men stridently disagreed with each other's politics and principles, the glorious cause of the Revolution and the free republic which came of it united them in personal sacrifice for the common good. You know what I'm going to say. Can't we do that now? Stop being so petty. Look at the good of us all. Forget about the party. Vote accordingly. It is time, my dear friends, for all of us to obey the law because we want to, not because we have to. To honor the law, even when we think it's wrong, and then find constitutional means to change it. Therein is civic virtue and the security of our free republic. Mark my words. Let's take a break. How are you tonight? I hope you're well. I'm going on a river cruise down the Danube in September. I love this tour. I'm looking forward to going back, learning more about it, seeing it again, experiencing those beautiful cities once more. I'm inviting you to come. If you would like to come on this adventure of a lifetime, a river cruise down the Danube, go to funforlesstours.com and check it out. Tell them I sent you. Tell them I invited you. Also with Fun for Less, I'm going to England in August of 2026, a year and a half away. I'll be doing 2 tours over there. I would like you to come, especially if you come from British, either English, Irish, Scottish, or Welsh ancestry. I'd really invite you to go back to the home country and learn that culture and see it for yourself. Once again, I ask you tonight, guys, share with me your favorite stories. And if you have any stories like them, let me have them. Share them with me if you can. Next story. The scene would have looked ordinary enough, I suppose. 2 men, one in his 20s and the other more advanced, middle-aged, standing by the bank of a beautiful river in the spring of the year, starting to run high, and throwing and skipping rocks across the surface of the river. It was welcome exercise. But then, according to his own account, as the older man was searching for another rock to throw, he saw one that looked very familiar. And without his companion's notice, he bent down and scooped up that rock and slipped it into his pocket. That older man was Martin Harris of Palmyra, New York. The other man, his younger companion at the Susquehanna River that day, well, that was Joseph Smith Jr. In those late spring, early summer days of 1828, Martin and Joseph worked in Joseph and Emma's small cabin, farm cabin there on the banks of the Susquehanna River, doing what? Translating the gold plates into the Book of Mormon. The 2 of them labored day after day in the translation process. Joseph translated using the Urim Thummim, or sometimes for the sake of convenience, he would translate with only the aid of the seer stone. And Martin Harris would write it all down. Can you imagine listening to that? Martin later explained the translating as follows, quote, by the aid of the seer stones, sentences would appear and were read by the prophet, and when finished, he would say, written. And if correctly written, the sentence would disappear and another appear in its place. If not written correctly, it would remain until corrected. End of quote. Well, of course, this was tiresome work. Their unused muscles would cry for relief and cramp up. It's for that reason that they would take a break, walk a few steps down to the river, and throw stones for exercise. The stone that Martin found on the bank of the river that day looked just like the seer stone that Joseph had been using. A plan formed in Martin's mind, a test, if you will. Martin took the rock and returned to the cabin. Somehow, he switched it with the real seer stone and then waited to see what would happen. If, as Martin related, if Joseph continued to translate as usual, then in Martin's mind, Joseph was a liar and a fraud. But if he didn't translate as normal, Martin said that Joseph came in, sat down, and remained silent, unusually and intently gazing in darkness, no traces of the usual sentences appearing. Much surprised, Joseph exclaimed, Martin, what is the matter? All is as dark as Egypt. End of quote. Well, Martin's countenance betrayed him. He couldn't hide what he had done. When Joseph asked Martin why he had done such a thing, Martin is reported to have said, to stop the mouths of fools. End of quote. Well, because of that experience and others that would follow, Martin overcame his doubts and eventually would go on to become one of the blessed witnesses of the Book of Mormon. Notwithstanding much affliction and many mistakes and the foibles and foolishness of human nature, Martin Harris would bear witness down to his last breath that Joseph Smith was a true prophet and that the Book of Mormon was of God. I have come to learn for myself, there are no perfect men in this world. There aren't even any except the Savior who've lived their lives without making foolish and serious mistakes. Whether it be in the Restoration, in politics, it does not matter where. We are all mortal. We all make mistakes. But the foolish mistakes of our mortality do not, should not overshadow those moments of brilliance when we submit ourselves to the hands of the Almighty and He works wonders and miracles by us, with us, and through us. So it was with Martin. So it has been with many. So it is with you. This next story, I wish I could say that it was a profound story, fraught with wisdom and great philosophy and powerful principles, but it isn't. I want to tell you a story about my old pickup. It's a 1972 Chevrolet two-wheel drive C15 pickup, affectionately known as Old Mustard. Why? Because it's the color of mustard. Well, part of it is. I've had that truck for a long time. Now, as our family grew up, many cars came and went through our family. But Old Mustard outlived every single one of them, down to the present day. The other cars were fancier. They were more comfortable, more features. But they're all gone now. Probably most of them in a scrapyard. But Mustard, he's still here. I still have him. He still runs. Winter to summer, he sits outside, not in a comfortable, warm garage. And yet, Mustard was always the one that started, always the one you could turn to in a pinch. When the work needed to be done, it was old Mustard that everybody turned to, and he always got the job done. I don't know if you've ever owned a rig like this, but if you haven't, you should. You can learn a lot. Battle scarred. Oh, mama. Mustard had to have been the ugliest truck in the county. There was nothing even remotely attractive or handsome about him. We once had a contest among my seminary students to see who could get an exact count on how many colors was his paint. We came up with, though I always suspected we were shooting low, we came up with the number of 23 different body colors paint, 23 different colors of paint on the body. Since that time, Mustard's been wrecked twice, 3 times, and rebuilt. All the shades of rust and primer have deepened and hued over time. He still is one of the ugliest old trucks going down the road. But he's a tough old warrior, still going. He taught each one of my children to drive, and he had been an excellent teacher. Somehow he endured gracefully the dents, the grinding gears, the folded bumper, and even knocking down a telephone pole and driving away. That old truck has taken us faithfully to beautiful scenic places, pulled camp trailers, and served our winter firewood as no other. He's always been low maintenance, always simple and easy to fix and never that expensive. Oh, sure, we had to do repairs once in a while. He wasn't perfect, but he was nothing compared. Those repairs were nothing compared to the pieces of plastic and junk that I bought in future vehicles. In fact, old Mustard is a better truck now than when he was built. Our family has loved him, poured money and devotion into him, and brought him back to look almost as good as brand new. Now, I don't know if you should love a piece of machinery. I was once told, don't love that which can't love you back. But we've loved him. Each of my children, at one point or another, have wanted to own him. They argue over who gets him when I'm dead. At one point, I finally settled the issue and said, none of you can have him. I want you to bury me in him. He's my casket. Let's go to the grave together. Not sure you can do that. Old Mustard is plain, very ordinary. He will never be anything but a work truck. There's nothing aspiring or pretentious or showman quality about him. He's exactly what you see. What you will never see is how faithful that old truck has been for more years than most of my children have been alive. A Hummer, he's not. A Jeep, he will never be. No one will ever go, ooh, when he cruises by. But if there's a heaven for faithful old trucks that never quit, old Mustard surely belongs there. I've actually had numerous offers to buy him. We've turned them all down. I suppose it would take more money than I can afford to replace him. Besides, how do you replace a trusted and true friend? I hope you know this story is true, but this story is also a parable. I'm not talking about a truck. As Old Mustard has given for my family, so I hope we will all give for the Lord and his family. The tranquil, steady, reliable, consistent dedication of a lifetime. No brilliant performances, just always there when you need him. So, you. Even if it's compound, and some of you are old enough to know what that means. Even if it's compound, let's get it in gear. Get the work done. Last story for tonight. There are those who've created an image of a Savior who is so gentle that he never is angry, so kind that he can't be harsh, and so forgiving that he just winks at our sins. Well, that image is wrong, and so wrong that it can foster a casual attitude towards the Lord's commandments. The reality is that Jesus cleared the temple with a whip, rebuked Peter severely, and turned his back on him and renounced publicly and insulted the Pharisees viciously. Matthew 25, speaking of that, has always seemed so out of character to me until recently. The Master's foremost accusation and epithet against the Pharisees was what? Hypocrisy. Why was Jesus so scathing on that subject? Okay, hypocrisy. As this is, of course, a sin, and the Lord felt so strongly about it, and there are so many of you out there like me who are trying to be good and have had that term used against you, well, perhaps it's needful to understand what hypocrisy is and why the Savior felt so strongly about it. All the world hates a hypocrite. Why? Because a hypocrite is a pretender, a deceiver. The word itself is Greek in origin and means actor. Generally, a hypocrite is someone who espouses a cause, publicly professes allegiance and devotion to certain principles and standards, but then willfully, intentionally lives a double life. In short, they preach high standards to a cause, but they live low lives against it. Of course, the religious are frequent targets of this accusation, and they are indeed at high risk. Not always is every religious soul guilty of hypocrisy, though. Why is that? Because hypocrites are conniving, deliberate deceivers. They know what they're doing. They deliberately walk in two opposite worlds. This is different than the person like you who is living to the best of their knowledge and ability the standards of perfection that the Lord taught, who are genuinely trying to be good, but still make mistakes, are still beset with weaknesses, still sin. A man cannot be a hypocrite when he continually acknowledges his weakness, his mistakes, and compels no man to live better than he does. Hypocrisy piggybacks arrogance. Both of them are an outgrowth of pride run amok. Hypocrisy tends to be judgmental, self-righteous, harsh, exacting, unjust. It may talk compassionately, but tends to act cruelly. Hypocrisy revels in glory and attention, devours praise and flattery as greedily as fine food and drink. Hypocrisy is obsessed with public appearance. It will go to extreme lengths to create an image of virtue, but close proximity always finds the filth within. It tends to be vicious in its effort to maintain its ill-gotten place. Those who attempt to expose hypocrisy, let me rephrase that. Those who attempt to expose the hypocrite will be publicly vilified. Hypocrites, and this may actually ride closer to why the Lord felt the way he did. Hypocrites are dangerous and especially destructive to the Lord's cause, because hypocrites slither in among us like undetected vipers. When they are finally found out and exposed, they destroy not only the individuals that have trusted them, that they have deceived, but the entire group becomes characterized by the loathsome behavior of that one wicked one. Hence, they not only lead away their friends, but they bring the whole cause to public condemnation and ill repute, principles and all. Perhaps it is for that reason that the only public vice more loathsome to the Almighty than a hypocrite is a traitor. And traitors are usually quickly discovered and disposed of. And hypocrites can work undetected among us for years. Hypocrisy always has numerous victims. Generally, they are innocent people who trust and pure principles. Both are ruthlessly sacrificed to satisfy a hypocrite's ego. That, my friend, is in part why the Savior of the world so soundly and publicly renounced hypocrisy and will inevitably detect every vestige of it in his people and expose it. He will not have it. Hence, my dear friends, to live your religion to the best of your ability, teach it meekly to others. Judge not the sins of others, lest you are found and judged in your own. Do the best you can, and live and let others do the same. In short, it is very likely, based on what I've told you, you are not a hypocrite. But that doesn't mean they aren't among us. I know of what I speak. It's because of hypocrisy, or at least the accusation thereof, that my father and my grandfather left the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints when they were young. And at least in one case, never came back. From the time I began to broadcast and teach principles of the gospel on the radio, Sounds of Sunday back in the day and still going, I knew that I would stand the charge of being a hypocrite, teaching principles of the gospel while struggling with my own weakness. At one point, I almost turned down the opportunity entirely because I knew that I wasn't capable of being as good as I wanted to be in teaching others. But I assure you, I've done the best I can. I've expected no one to be better than me and have not condemned them. I've been open to the charge of being a hypocrite, but I know what that charge means. And in my own heart and mind, I'm not. Neither are you. The Lord loves us when we try. And he has, and he always will, be able to work with flawed mortals. I love the Lord. I am grateful for his mercy, his compassion, and for his readiness and willingness to comfort the wounded heart. Good night, my friends. Have a great week. God bless.